Hey everybody, it's me, Mr. White Guy. Today we're reading Fazbear Frights again, the second story of Prankster called Kids at Play. Here's hoping it's better than the first one because I did not like it. I thought that the ending was a bit sudden, and while the rest of the story was okay, it just didn't feel like FNAF all that much, which is what I say about all these stories now, but especially for that one. The fact that they were developing a FNAF VR game in the story was kind of unrelated to anything. So really not sure what that's about, but I guess we will hope this is better. This one's apparently pretty messed up, but it also has, from the non-spoiler reviews I've read, a pretty weird antagonist that makes Fazgoo look actually like it makes sense. So we'll see. Let's see how this goes. "You're not going to be a kid forever, Joel." "As if I'd want to be," Joel muttered. He was just a few more steps from his pickup. 2 more seconds. That was what he needed to get to his ride and get away before he was caught. 2 freaking seconds. Joel sighed with enough volume, head roll, and shoulder action to communicate his annoyance, and he turned to glare at his dad. Now what? It's only 5:53. He decided to play dumb. "Your point? You're off at 6, not 5:53. You're nagging me about 7 minutes? Joel's dad looked up at the hazy blue sky for a minute, and then wiped the back of his hand across his forehead. His palm, of course, was perfectly clean. How did he do that? Joel had been working at the family business, as his mother liked to call his dad's business. I can't read this. Agostino's Nursery and Garden Center, after school, and every summer since he'd turned 14. The job had been 4 years of near-daily torture, shoveling, lifting, carting, weeding, and saying, "Yes, ma'am," and "Yes, sir," and "Whatever you'd like," when what he really wanted to say was, well, something totally different and not even polite. Ever since he'd started working for his dad, Joel had smelled like sweat and dirt, or worse, manure. His mother, who used to tell him daily how much she loved him, had replaced her "I love you" with "Take a shower, Joel." When he'd complained that it wasn't his fault he smelled all the time, it was the stupid job, she'd countered with, "Well, your dad's been running D'Agostino's for 25 years, and he never goes around stinking like a cow turd steaming in a mud puddle." Yeah, his dad. The perfect man, the one everyone loved, the guy who never sweat, the dude who was so special that dirt and fertilizer didn't have the audacity to touch him. Joel blinked and realized his dad was talking. He tuned into the words that came in mid-sentence. "Think you're going to ever find an employer who isn't going to carry you leave work a few minutes early every day? You can't be irresponsible forever. God knows I've cut you more slack than I should have. Your mother kept asking me to go easy on you. And what's that gotten us? An 18-year-old who acts like an 8-year-old, that's what. You're a screw-up, Joel. A total screw-up." Joel took a deep breath and wrinkled his nose at the sickly sweet smell of cherry blossoms, which were blooming late this year for some reason. They kept dripping pink bits all over the nursery, which the breeze would then pick up and blow around. Joel's dad insisted on a clean nursery, which meant no fallen blossoms were allowed to litter the property. Joel had probably swept up several million of the damn things today alone. Joel put his hands on his narrow hips. Several girls had told him he looked gorgeous when he did that. He cocked his head at his dad. "Are you done yet?" His dad threw up his hands and bellowed, "You're fired." Joel frowned. Okay, so he hated the job. However, his dad paid him $2 an hour above any other wage Joel had been able to find, and at least the job was a daytime job. Everything else he looked into required working late nights, which would cut into his personal time with the band. Until he could skip town, which wasn't going to be until graduation, 2 long months away, the truth was that working at a nursery was the best job he had available at the moment. And he had to have a job. He couldn't pile up money he needed to get to LA if he didn't keep working. He faced his dad. "You can't fire me because I'm leaving work 7 minutes early." Steve D'Agostino looked around as if feigning confusion across his dark face. Joel blinked. He'd just gotten that weird feeling he sometimes felt from his dad, like he was looking at an older version of himself. When his dad widened his brown eyes like that, he looked a lot like Joel, who'd received most of his strong features from his dad, but whose eyes were as big and heavily lashed as Mom's. It was a good combination. Once a lady had come up to him in the grocery store to ask if he was a model. That, in fact, was something he planned to do when he got to LA. It would support him while he got his music career going. "Am I suffering under a delusion here?" Joel's dad asked. "Is it not true that as the owner of this place I can do whatever I darn well please? Is there some other boss around here I haven't heard about? Some dude," he was mimicking Joel's frequent use of the word, "who gets to call the shots?" "Funny dude," Joel said. "I'm just saying it's stupid to fire someone for leaving 7 minutes early." "You think so, huh?" His dad's voice was louder now. "Well, let's do the math, shall we?" Joel looked around to see if anyone was watching him get lectured like a dumb little kid. A couple old biddies were inspecting the leaves on the cherry trees at the edge of the parking lot. A family was clustered around the plastic pinwheel lawn ornaments near the front door of the garden center. At the far side of the nursery, Joel's coworker, Seth, shoveled beauty bark into the back of one of the delivery trucks. Good. No one of consequence was around. Joel glanced at his watch. It was now 6 p.m. He interrupted his dad's droning calculations and tapped his watch. Well, now I'm not leaving early. You think you're a funny guy, don't you? Joel's dad shook his head. I don't need to do the math. I've already done it. Over the time you spent working for me, I've paid you more than 67 hours beyond what you've actually worked. That's easily $1,000 you got for doing absolutely nothing. Joel shrugged. So what? I'm your son. You owe me. Joel's dad stared at Joel for 10 solid seconds. After the first 3, Joel thought about getting in his truck and leaving. But for some reason he couldn't look away from his dad. When Joel was little, he thought his dad was the coolest guy on the planet. Unlike his friends' dads, Joel's dad was big and broad-shouldered and fit, kind of like a superhero. He didn't drive a boring old sedan like other dads. He drove a great big shiny black truck. His dad also didn't wear typical fatherly attire like drab khakis and polo shirts either. When Joel's dad wasn't at the nursery, he dressed in flashy clothes, dressy slacks and bright shirts and patterned ties. People around town loved Steve Agostino. He could make a crowd erupt in laughter, charm any woman, befriend anyone he wished. At home, he was funny and attentive. When Joel was a kid, his dad had been fun. Father and son would spend the summers joking around and doing cool things together. Joel's dad played guitar, and he taught his son early on, instilling in him a love of music. He even brought Joel a drum set when Joel asked for one, and they'd formed a 2-person rock band. Something weird had happened, though, when Joel had reached his teens. The rules changed. He was no longer allowed to play and do whatever he wanted to. His dad expected something of Joel that he just couldn't give. His dad wanted him to stop having fun. He wanted Joel to get serious and grow up. After a while, Joel stopped fighting it. By sophomore year, he was all for growing up because it meant he could get away from his smothering parents in this backward small town. It meant he could go play music where someone would appreciate him instead of yelling at him for it. But why did growing up having to mean get serious? Why did he have to stop having fun? Joel blinked when he felt a tug and heard a rip. He looked down. What the? His dad had just torn the name tag off Joel's shirt with such force it left a hole. I'm done with you, his dad said. Just get out of here. Joel felt blood flood his face. His temples throbbed. He clenched his fists. Now, his dad growled. Joel threw up his hands. Fine. He turned and yanked open the door of his pickup. Joel flung himself behind the wheel, pulling his long legs into the cab, and slammed the door. He heard gravel crunching and looked out the driver's side window to see his dad walking back to the garden center. Whatever. Joel turned the ignition key. Once, twice, 3 times. The old engine finally turned over and sputtered before settling into a chug-like rumble. Joel slammed his hand against the steering wheel. His dad thought he'd done Joel so many freaking favors, like buying this pickup. I bought you a truck, Joel, his dad often said to him when Joel was complaining about not getting something he wanted. So what? It was a 20-year-old pickup with standard transmission. Thanks for small favors, dude, Joel thought. Joel slapped the gear shift into reverse. He ground the gears and the truck shot forward. He could hear gravel flying under the pickup's chassis. He hoped he was leaving big furrows in his dad's precious, the gravel needs to be kept smooth and even parking lot. It would serve the jackass right. Joel ground the gears again as he shifted into first. He pressed hard on the accelerator and the engine whined, protesting the excessive speed in low gear. Joel quickly shifted through second and third as he kept accelerating. He exited the parking lot at 45 miles per hour in third gear. Gravel was still flying. He heard it ping off the D'Agostino sign at the front edge of the parking lot. His tires squealed as he careened out into the road. Someone honked, but he didn't even look behind him as to see why. He just put the accelerator to the floor and took the truck up to over 60 miles per hour as quickly as the old geezer of a vehicle would allow. Another car honked. Someone shouted. Joel didn't care. I'm just going to call them the D's from now on. D's was just outside the so-called downtown, a pathetic, scraggly collection of dying businesses scattered over several semi-abandoned blocks. The garden center and nursery complex was on the main road, a narrow 2-lane, pothole-filled strip of pavement that eventually led to a state highway. Although it was the main road, the speed limit was only 30 miles per hour. Stupid slow. The D family house was just 3 miles from the nursery. Joel liked to see how fast he could drive the short distance. Today, he couldn't get home fast enough. He needed to get back to his room and get on those drum pads. If he wanted to pound out his frustration, if he could have got to his buddy Zach's place to play drums for real, he would have, but Zach and his family weren't home today, some kind of family thing. Zach's dad didn't want Joel or the other members of the band coming over when no one was there. Joel took the turn off the main road so fast his tires squealed again. He grinned and accelerated onto the straightaway that ran west of the main street. A few blocks later, he was in the heart of the Old Town residential area. The neighborhood of big gnarled trees and sloping green lawns and uppity Victorian houses where all the town somebodies lived. The families who had been here forever. Joel actually thought these families, which included his own, were the nobodies, the people too stupid to see that their town was a waste of space, the people too lazy or scared or stupid to leave and try life someplace else. The thought of these immovable families, all the old ways of thinking and the endless judgments and criticisms, like those of his dad, pissed off Joel so much that his foot jammed the accelerator down even harder, and he took the next turn faster than he'd ever taken it before. He took it so fast that he went into a skid. For a couple seconds, he had no control over the vehicle. He slid around the corner, his tires jittering over the uneven pavement. Joel let out a whoop of acceleration. It felt good to be untethered to the rules, to what was right. The back of his truck hit something with a heavy whump, followed by a crack. Uh-oh. It sounded like he'd taken out a mailbox. Joel sighed and slammed on his brakes. The truck lurched to a stop, throwing him forward and back and rocking for a couple seconds as he shoved the gear shift into neutral and set the parking brake. He let the engine idle as he got out to see what he'd crunched. Not that he cared a lot, but getting in trouble didn't serve his purposes right now. Especially given that his dad had fired him. He needed to suck up to someone to get a better job, and most of the someones worth sucking up to lived in this neighborhood. If he'd broken a mailbox, he should probably fix it. Joel walked around the truck and looked down at the shoulder. He lifted his brows. He hadn't hit a mailbox. A 3-foot-tall, neon-yellow-green plastic figure, vaguely shaped like a kid, lay on its side in the dirt behind Joel's truck. The kid held a triangular orange flag that had the words "Kids at Play" printed in the back. The color of the sign matched the orange hat that was molded across the top of the kid's plastic head. Across what could have been called the figure's hips, the word "slow" shined under a red reflector. Joel laughed. Heck of a lot of good this little dude had done just now. Joel hadn't even seen it, much less felt compelled to heed its stupid warning. He noticed the plastic figure's legs were cracked, probably as a result of their impact with Joel's truck. No big deal, the figure would still work. Okay, so it's like Sergio's Lucky Day. We got another Balloon Boy kind of character, except it's not Balloon Boy, obviously. It's just some plastic child. Very cool. What a cool character to make the antagonist of this story. The second last one in all of the main Fazbear Frights series. Joel started to turn away from the figure, but for some reason its large round black eyes and gaping empty mouth caught his attention. He paused. Goosebumps formed in his bare arms as he stared at the lifeless, sightless little face. He shook his head and rubbed his eyes. Whatever, Joel said aloud. He looked around. He was alone, so he once again started to return to his truck. And again, he stopped. This time his attention was caught by a disgusting sludge puddle by the plastic figure's feet. What was that? It wasn't mud, it wasn't dog doo-doo, it was... Joel bent over to see the sludge more clearly, and he immediately recoiled. It's Fazgoo! The brownish, lumpy mass looked like a dog had melted into a semi-liquid ooze. Joel took a step back and made a face. That's gross. Thoroughly creeped out, Joel rotated once more to see if anyone was watching him. He didn't see a soul on the street, and all the houses either had pulled curtains or darkened windows. Joel hurried back to his open driver's door and jumped into the truck. Putting it in gear, he popped off the brake and drove away as fast as he could without squealing the tires. He didn't want to make more sound than was necessary. Why? Because it might wake the sleeping plastic kid? Joel snorted at the thought. Yeah, right, he muttered. He turned on his radio to drown out the remaining heebie-jeebies that tickled the hairs in the back of his neck. Joel's mom was waiting for him when he pulled his pickup into the driveway. She stood on the covered wraparound porch, hands buried in the pockets of her high-waisted mom jeans. Even from 30 feet away, Joel could see her furrowed brows and her compressed lips. She was obviously pissed about something. Great. He was tempted to take off again, but he was still feeling weird because of the plastic kid thing. He wanted to go up to his room and shut out the world. To do that, he'd have to get past his mom. Joel was an only child, and as such, he always figured he should be appropriately spoiled and coddled. His best friend Wes was also an only child, and Wes got whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. Joel, however, had parents who were committed to making sure he wasn't spoiled. Over the years, he tried to manipulate them into getting him whatever he wanted, but he'd given up at some point. You have to work for what you get in life, Joel, his parents were always telling him. If we give you everything, you won't know how to make your way in the world. I'll figure it out, he told him. Why not give me a few easy years before I get to the hard ones? They didn't find his reasoning persuasive or his humor amusing. Unlike Wes's parents, who told him it was okay when he made C's and D's in school, Joel's parents not only lamented his poor grades, they punished him for them. His truck was a perfect example of that. When Joel got to high school, his dad told him that he'd buy Joel a new truck when Joel got his license, provided he got good grades. For every semester he got bad grades, the truck he received would be a year older. Joel tried to get good grades for a semester, but it was too much work. It cut into his music playing and hanging out time. So he did the math and figured a 5-year-old truck wasn't such a bad thing. He gave up trying to get decent grades. When it came time for him to get his truck, his dad told Joel how disappointed he was in Joel's school performance. Joel proudly told his dad his reasoning for being lazy, which turned out to be a bad move. His dad was so angry he punished Joel for his impertinence by taking off another 15 years from the new truck. That was how Joel ended up with a 20-year-old truck. "You should be glad your dad bought you a truck at all," Joel's mother had said when he complained about it to her. She always took his dad's side. "Your father is a wonderful man, a great father. He does the best for this family," she'd said more times than Joel wanted to remember. Now he could tell by his mother's angry scowl that getting past her wasn't going to be easy. He decided trying to act innocent and clueless and see what that got him. He got out of his truck and waved at his mom casually. "Hey, Mom." "Don't you hey Mom me," she snapped. "Your father called." Joel sighed and loped toward his mother. He made sure he kept his shoulders back, his head high, and his stroll in his usually confident swagger. Mariana, the prettiest girl in his class, lived across the street. Her bedroom window looked out over the road. She'd never given him the time of day, but he figured there was always hope. After all, he made jeans and black t-shirts look hot. All the other girls thought so. They didn't seem to mind he wasn't romantic or gentlemanly or any of that crap. He got dates whenever he wanted them. Mariana, though, was one date he couldn't get. "Your charm is like plastic wrap, Joel," she'd said to him once. "What's that supposed to mean?" he'd asked. "It's thin, and because it's see-through, it doesn't cover up what a jerk you are." Joel flicked against Marianne's window as he walked toward his mother. If she was watching, the only two women he wanted to impress were seeing him at a low point. That sucked. Joel stepped up onto the porch and looked in his mom's dark eyes. Joel loved his mother, but she could be intimidating. She was a tall woman with a sturdy body, and she always wore no-nonsense clothes, usually dark slacks or high-waisted jeans and bright-colored blouses. Today's was magenta. Her features were kind of large for her face. She actually could have passed for a man if she hadn't worn her hair long, but she commanded attention. He couldn't look away from her when she was mad. Dad was in a mood, Joel tried. "Cut it out, Joel. You know darn well you've pushed your dad beyond the limits any parent should have to endure. You show up late to work, do as little as possible while you're there, and you leave early. He was going to let it slide until you went off to college, but then you announced you weren't going to college. Not that you could get in with your grades. At that point, your dad figured you didn't need the money, so he kept you on, in spite of the fact that you're going to break his heart and go join a crazy rock band or whatever it is you plan to do. But even he has his breaking point." Joe looked at his feet. "I'm sorry, Mom." He tilted his head and gave her a sideways glance that always used to make her melt. She blew out air. "You're a good-looking boy, Joel, I'll give you that. But looks won't get you anything. You need a little personality to go with them. And right now, yours needs a lot of work." Joel shrugged. "I'm going up to my room." His mom opened her mouth, and closed it, and made a shooing motion with her hand. "Fine, go." Joel brushed past her and stomped into his house. He heard her sigh behind him as he tracked dirt across the gray-tiled entryway. Served her right. He was kind of hungry and wanted a snack, but more than that, he wanted to be alone. He ran up the wide staircase to the second floor, strode down the hall, and went into his room. Slamming the door, he started for the drumsticks, but instead grabbed his acoustic guitar from its stand in the corner of his room. He flopped on his bed with it. Curling his fingers over the frets, Joel concentrated on the latest set of chords he was trying to master. They were bar chords, which he'd always had trouble with. Getting the strength in his fingers necessary to hold down all the strings on the fret at once took hundreds of hours of practice, and even now, after years of playing, he did struggle with some of the less common chords. He had to learn them, though. He didn't want the music he was writing to be ordinary. He wasn't going to use the usual easy chords or the standard chord progressions. He wanted to create music that pushed boundaries. Boundaries. That was his whole problem. He was locked in by so many rules. They made him go crazy, so crazy he felt like he was a walking ball of anger all the time. He didn't mean to be, but he couldn't help himself. He felt like a tiger trapped in a cage, a tiger so frustrated that it couldn't help but roar at everyone. Joel went through his new chords twice, then he started combining them with complex picking. The mix sounded super cool. Joel grinned as a new song about breaking boundaries began to form in his head. But the fledgling memory was silenced when Joel's mother threw open his bedroom door. Joel's fingers froze in the guitar. Joel's mom walked over to his dresser and put clean socks in a drawer. "That sounded interesting," she said. Joel frowned. Interesting wasn't what he was going for. But he wasn't going to say anything. He never tried to explain his music to his parents. It wasn't for them to understand, it was for him, and for the fans he'd eventually have when he was able to leave this town and play someplace where he'd be appreciated. Joel's mom flicked a look from Joel to the plush-backed stool that sat in the corner with his instruments. She put her hands on her hips. "Why do we bother getting you that stool if you're going to slouch in your bed when you play the guitar?" She shook her head and left his room, muttering to herself. As soon as she closed her bedroom door, Joel threw a pillow at it. "Why do we bother?" he mimicked her. "Why do we bother?" was one of his mom's favorite lines. This line applied to anything she or Joel's dad did that Joel should appreciate more. For instance, she loved to ask, "Why do we bother getting you nice clothes if you're not going to take care of them?" And "Why do we bother getting you a tutor if you're not going to show up for your lessons?" He never answered her when she asked these questions, but if he had, he'd have said something like, "Who asked for nice clothes? Jeans and a t-shirt are fine. And when did I ask for a tutor?" If he thought he could get away with it, he'd have the most to say in answer to her question about his room. Why'd we bother decorating your room if you were going to trash it? Well, Joel did ask her to bring in a professional decorator to coordinate just the right beige and blue striped curtains to go with the dark blue walls in his room. Did he ask for the custom oak study center, desk, and credenza attached to the built-in filing cabinets and shelves, and the matching chest of drawers and nightstand and dresser? Did he care about the imported Turkish rug, or the framed art prints of rare plants? Did he need a state-of-the-art brushed steel ceiling fan and light? Did stuff like thread count and pillow shapes matter to him? Why did he need 6 decorative pillows anyway? When his room was straightened up the way his mom liked it, which only happened when either she or the housekeeper did it, the damn pillows took up most of his queen-size bed. All Joel had ever wanted for his room was enough space for his drum set and guitars, a professional soundboard, and soundproofing. Instead, he got a room full of hoity-toity men's club-looking furniture and decorative crap, which forced him to cram his instruments, the only thing he did care about, into a corner, and the lack of soundproofing made it really hard to practice. His parents always were either making comments on music he wanted to keep to himself, or they were yelling at him to keep it down. The problem with Joel's mom and dad was that they had decided what was right for him, and they got mad at him for having a different idea. He never got to choose for himself. Over the years, this had made him so resentful that he could no longer appreciate even the rare things they did that he actually liked. Joel gritted his teeth and started playing his guitar again. He sang softly along. "Boundaries stealing choice from me, shoving, forcing, making me be not me." He stopped. That was lame. Joel sighed and laid back on his pillow, cradling his silent guitar. If only I could leave now, he thought. His dad told him if he didn't graduate from high school, Joel would never receive another penny from his dad. Not now, not if he got in trouble, not even after his dad was dead. Joel believed him. At the moment, he'd been willing to give up any of that money just to get away, but he didn't have enough saved to make the trip, or to get his own place. He needed to stay at home a little longer. And now he had to find a new job, unless he could find a way to make his dad forgive him. Maybe he could convince his dad to take him back. Joel thought about that for a while, which was worse, groveling to his dad or going out and trying to find a different job. Both choices sucked, but he finally decided apologizing would be a less time-consuming than job hunting. By putting on what he thought was an award-worthy acting performance over a dinner of roast beef, red potatoes, and peas, Joel was able to persuade his dad to let him keep working until the end of the school year. Joel had been all, "I'm really sorry I've been acting like a jerk," and he'd thrown in a bunch of stuff like, "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I get that I need to make some changes. And I think I've been taking things for granted, and I'm not going to do that anymore." He thought his blah-blah-blah lies had gone well with the blah meal. Joel's mom was into cooking simple food. She actually took classes on how to put together meals with the fewest ingredients possible. He wished he didn't have time for classes like that. The food was terribly bland, but she only had a part-time work-at-home hobby job, writing knitting patterns and selling them online. This gave her too much time to discover new things, like cooking simply. For the last 2 years, nothing they ate had any flavor. Last Christmas, he tried to fix that by spending some of his own money to buy a spice rack filled with 30 spices for his mom. She'd ended up giving away all but a dozen of the spices. "What use do I have for ginger and coriander?" she said, as she'd put them in a bag to donate to charity. And his parents wondered why he'd never do stuff for them. What was the point? It was never right, anyway. Just 2 more months. The next morning, feeling pretty pleased with himself for getting the job back, Joel slouched in one of the burgundy velveteen-covered stools in front of the aircraft carrier-sized island in his mother's restaurant-quality kitchen. For probably the 3,000th time, Joel looked from the bowl of cold cereal to the flashy stainless steel appliances and the gleaming back granite countertops in his mother's kitchen. How did these two things make sense? About 10 years before, his dad surprised his mom with this massive kitchen remodel, instead of building Joel the soundproof music studio he wanted. His dad had bought all state-of-the-art this and top-quality that, and Joel still got cold cereal 6 mornings a week. The only time he got a hot breakfast was on Sunday mornings before church, and that was only because his dad was home. Monday through Saturday, Joel's dad left the house before dawn to get the garden center ready to open. Too often, Joel was expected to go in early with his dad. More than half the time he had the early shift, he overslept. What normal person wouldn't? It wasn't natural to wake up when it was still dark. Joel ground his way through a second bowl of Fazbear Frights Crunch cereal. There's the FNAF reference, probably the only one that'll be in this story, knowing how this series has gone. We probably won't hear anything about FNAF for the rest of the story, yay. Wishing the whole time it was something else, like curried eggs and bacon with hash browns. Maybe he should have gone over to Zach's house. Zach's mom always made what she called farmhouse breakfasts. Glaring at your cereal isn't going to turn it into pancakes, or whatever you're wishing it was, Joel's mom said as she tossed a knitting magazine on the counter next to him and sat down next to him. Just because you don't eat breakfast doesn't mean you shouldn't feed your family breakfast, Joel grumbled. It's not fair to make me eat cereal every day because you think coffee is all a person needs in the morning. Joel's mom put down her magazine and turned to look at him. "You've an interesting perspective, Joel," his mom said. He frowned at her. "What's that mean?" "You've conveniently forgotten all the days you were little, when I got up early and fixed your eggs, or pancakes, or waffles, or oatmeal, only to have you run down the stairs, late as always, and yell, 'I don't have time, Mama, just give me cereal.' After dumping a few dozen breakfasts down the garbage disposal, I got the message." She pointed at the cereal box. "That's what you wanted. That's what you get." "Yeah, well, it sucks, and I don't think it's too fair to punish me for something I don't even remember doing." His mom crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow at him. "What happened to, 'I get that I need to make some changes'?" She did a pretty good impression of his voice as she shoved the previous night's sucking up back in his face. She took a deep breath, then frowned and shook her head. "You didn't bother to shower this morning, did you? As usual?" Joel pressed his lips together. Again with the showering, his mother was obsessed with cleanliness. "I didn't have time," he said. "But you have time to sit here and grouse about the food you're eating, which was provided to you free of charge, by the way." Joel wanted to say something snarky to that, but he knew anything he said would get back to his dad. When his dad agreed to let him come back to work, it had come with a warning. You'd better keep your nose clean, no slacking off, no back talk. So Joel kept his mouth shut. His mom wrinkled her nose and picked up her coffee and her magazine. "I think I'm going to take my coffee up to my office and read my magazine in peace." "Whatever," Joel muttered. His mother stood next to the island for a moment and stared at him. Then she sighed and left the kitchen. Joel rolled his eyes and grimaced at the couple soggy bits of Faz Crunch that floated in his bowl. He'd already had 2 bowls of the stuff, and he was still hungry. He picked up the bright red box and, putting his thumb over Freddy Fazbear's face, tried to shake a third bowl's worth out of the nearly empty box. A couple more cereal bits fell out, along with something small and yellowy wrapped in cellophane. Right, the toy prize inside every box. Does anyone actually do that still? Do any cereals actually still do that? I don't even remember that from when I was a kid. I don't remember that at all. Must have been before my time, I suppose. Fishing the prize out of the milk with his spoon, and spraying the counter with milk in the process, Joel looked at the toy. Was that... He wiped the cellophane on the napkin lying next to his cereal bowl, and tore open the wrapping to see the toy more clearly. It couldn't be what he thought it was. The plastic toy clattered to the counter, and Joel flinched. It was what he thought it was. The toy was a miniature version of the same freaky yellow plastic kid-shaped figure he'd hit with his truck yesterday. Just like that figure, the toy held an orange triangular flag that read, "Kids at Play." But first, this video is sponsored by the Elementia Studios Discord. On there, you can chat with other FNAF fans and just fans of the channel. You can showcase your fan art, you can discuss your theories, you can just hang out with cool people. It's fun, you'll like it. So the link will be in the description, so you can check it out if you want to. That's about it. Just like that figure, the toy had "Slow" printed across its hips, under a red reflector. It had the same orange hat, the black eyes, the gaping mouth. The thing was identical in all respects, except for size, to the plastic figure Joel had hit. Identical even to the way it made him feel when he looked at it. The thing seriously weirded him out. "That's just whacked," Joel said aloud, as if to snap himself out of it. What were the odds? Why would anyone even make a toy that looked like that stupid kid figure? Joel shivered, then flicked the stupid toy off the counter with his index finger. It hit the floor with a clickety-click, slid across the polished hardwood, and landed between a heat register vent and the baseboard trim in the corner of the kitchen. Joel looked at it for a couple seconds, then left the kitchen, leaving his empty bowl and the empty cereal box on the counter. As he always did. He figured if he had to eat cereal every day, it served his mother right to have to clean up the dregs of it. Joel glanced at the clock over the stove. He'd better get a move on. He was going to be late for school. One more official tardy notice and he'd have to do after-school detention. If he got detention, he couldn't work. Without work, he couldn't get the money he needed. Life seriously sucked. Nothing you wanted came without paying for it. And when your parents wouldn't pay for the stuff you wanted, well, you had to get the money yourself. That meant you spent most of your life doing crap you didn't want to do, just to eventually have enough money to do something you did want to do. But by then, you didn't have enough time to do what you wanted because you were working to pay for it. Man, boy can I relate. Joel barely made it to school on time, and after school, he barely made it to work on time. Once there, he had to stay until 6 p.m. exactly. Actually, he stayed 5 minutes after, just to be sure his dad got the point that he wasn't slacking. He had to do the same thing the next day, and the next day, and the next day, until finally it was Friday. At 6:08 p.m., Joel trudged toward his truck, muttering under his breath and kicking gravel as he went. His dad wanted Joel to work early the next morning to load up a special order for delivery. On a Saturday morning, that wasn't fair at all. His dad knew Joel and his friends liked practicing late on Friday nights. Joel would be wiped in the morning, and now he couldn't sleep in. The worst part was that he couldn't even complain because he'd promised not to. But if his promise meant late evenings and early mornings, then he... Ow, watch what you're doing, young man. Joel lifted his eyes and looked around. He groaned when his gaze landed on old Mrs. Linden. At least 90 years old, Mrs. Linden was this bony old lady who visited the garden center at least once a week. "Gardening keeps the bones young," she said every single time she came to buy a new plant or new tool. The woman repeated herself over and over and over again. This was especially tiresome, since Mrs. Linden was a talker. She rambled constantly about everything that was going on in her life, about her grown kids and their problems, about her aches and pains and doctor's appointments, and of course, about every minuscule thing that had happened in her huge garden. The bees have been hovering around my forsythia more than usual. I nearly cut a caterpillar in half when I was planting the new alyssum. One of the branches broke on my tam juniper. Okay, well, I'm struggling reading every other word now, so I'm going to stop and take a break, because that's usually a sign that I need to, and we will continue this next time with part 2, where hopefully we will actually get to the spooky stuff, because we have not yet. This could get interesting, or it could get very, very bad. Joel is yet another fairly unlikable character, and yet I can't say I really like his parents either, so great. Big fan of these characters. We'll see where this goes, I guess. Thank you guys for listening. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.